Hello, thank you all for being here. I'm Marlena Dowd, and I'm going to give some brief introductions of our three speakers who so graciously agreed to appear here today. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about the format for this conversation, as we're calling it, Conversations in Caribbean Studies. And the idea was to have three scholars come and give very short presentations in which they are sort of invited to reflect on questions of process and how they came to their topics and how their work interacts with prior works. And so the goal was to have them talk to and with each other rather than about and at each other and us. And so they're going to give, as I mentioned, shorter presentations. They're going to have a dialogue among one another. I'm going to ask them a question at the end, and then we're going to open it up for all of you to ask your questions as well. So this is an experiment of sorts, and I'm very grateful for our sponsors, the Center for the Americas, the Carter G. Woodson Institute, the Institute for Humanities and Global Cultures, and the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities for allowing me to sort of take on this little experiment and do this as a part of the South Atlantic Seminar series that the VFH hosts with the college. So I'm going to start by introducing the first speaker. Let's see if I can get this to come back up. We were having a little bit of technical difficulties, but and so I'm kind of marrying the tradition of the Carter Woodson Institute, which is that we don't formally introduce people because sometimes it's just sort of a litany of things and they're all so accomplished. So what I did instead was I wanted to just mention an anecdote about each of them, and I put some of their many publications up here. And especially since they had pretty covers for their books, I decided to focus on that. But I just wanted to, and by way of thanking them for their wonderful interventions in the fields of New World Studies and Caribbean Studies and American Studies more broadly. So the first speaker is Laurent Dubois from Duke University. And I would just say that one of the most noteworthy things for people who know Laurent is that he's essentially an expert at bringing other people to the table, people who are less visible. And so that was definitely my experience when a roundtable on Verre de Vate was held at Duke University, and just the sense and spirit of inclusivity to bring someone who was very early in her career, and where I got to meet professors from the State University of Haiti, including Jean Casimir and the now deceased Carrie Hector. The second speaker is going to be Julia Gaffield from Georgia State University. And, so is Greg going to go? Well, I'm going to introduce them in this order, but they have switched it up. But the funny thing is that Julia was involved in the Haiti lab, but that's not actually where we first met. I had to rethink in my memory, and I thought, we met in Haiti, and it was like a day after Barack Obama was elected president, and we all were in Haiti, and we were in a remote part of Haiti, and our cell phones didn't work, so we weren't actually sure if it really happened or not, if we dreamed it, or if we came back to the US and everything had imploded. But Julia gave a wonderful paper, and I knew she was going to be a star then. She was talking about Haiti in the British press, and shortly thereafter I was not surprised at all to learn that she had located the first printed copy of the Haitian Declaration of Independence, and so you see one of her edited collections there is about that. And then in the middle of the table is Gregory Pierrot from the University of Connecticut. Interestingly enough, I met Gregory through his work, the middle book there, An Historical Account of the Black Empire of Haiti. There's a footnote in the book. Those of you who know me know I love a fellow named Verre de Vate, historical figure. There's a footnote, one footnote about Verre de Vate, and I said, I have to meet this person who has a footnote about and so I really admired his sleuthing skills. So he's graciously coming on a journey with me to do an anthology of Haitian revolutionary fictions, and in the process of that has been, like our other guests, a translator and an editor. And so this is just my way of saying thank you all for being such a huge part of my life as a scholar, and as a colleague, and as friends. They're going to take it away now, and at the end I will show an image that I hope will be a jumping off point also for discussion. So I'm going to leave, is it okay if I leave your images up here? Actually, I'll leave it on this. These are some of their other works, 3 of their digital humanities projects. So Laurent's project of musical passages, Greg's project of Mairie, Chef des Haïtiens, and Julia's Haiti in the Atlantic World. But they also, in addition to engaging scholarship, engaging the public through their scholarship, have also written articles that have really kind of made a huge impact on the way that we understand Haiti's role in the United States, in the Atlantic world, and really kind of bringing in other people who might not necessarily buy scholarly monographs. And so they have all contributed these, and I'm going to leave that as their background while they're discussing. So hand it over to you. There's a microphone here that you can put on if you feel like you need it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's also okay sitting right there. You sound great, so
Okay.
your preference, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Marlene. It's such an honor to be here, and I thank you for organizing this, for all your amazing work on Haiti itself, and making it visible in all these ways. And also Deborah, Robert, all the faculty from Woodson. It's great to be here, and especially to be here with Gregory and Julia to have this conversation. So what I'm going to do is to sort of go back to the writing of Avengers of the New World, a book that I now realize is 15 years old, and sort of think about the kind of conjuncture that this work came out of, and then in relationship to sort of this conversation about what's happened since. And it's sort of a way to think about the kind of training, my own training as a history and anthropology PhD from the University of Michigan, and just the field of Haitian Revolutionary studies and how it's changed. These have been the last about 15 years of really extraordinary production. And really now, when I went back and thought about this, come to realize what a crossroads, that this really was emerged because of a crossroads of different intellectual projects and influences that I was lucky enough to be embedded in the 1990s, where I was training and afterwards. And in particular, thinkers and mentors who opened up the possibility of telling this story. Going back to it, realizing that when I was in graduate school, I was at least not aware of any other graduate student who was working on the Haitian Revolution in history, and not really in other fields. I had chosen between a few graduate schools, but one of them was the possibility of working at Hopkins with Michel Reltrio and Sidney Mintz were still there. But basically, the idea of a field of Haitian studies, of Haitian revolutionary studies particularly, was not something very strong. And indeed, I was often told that it was a very bad idea professionally to work on this topic. Still a confusion thing. You know, was it Latin American? Was it North American? Was it European? I do remember vividly being at some conference and a professor of history from somewhere, I don't remember who this was, sort of said, well, you can't write the history of the Haitian Revolution because everything was burned during the, like not all the documents are gone. I later realized all these are absurd, but there was some kind of sense that there wasn't quite a place for it in the map of, at least of the fields that I was familiar with at the time. So I was really lucky that these three mentors I'll mention too, there were obviously others, but Fernando Coronil, who is a Venezuelan anthropologist who passed away a few years ago, was my actually dissertation chair. Julia Scott, whose book The Common Wind has recently been published at last and was a huge influence, and then Rebecca Scott, a historian of Cuba and the broader Caribbean. And the fact that they were kind of open to this topic, right, and kind of understood it was really key. Now, obviously, Julius was the one who had most closely worked on the revolution. I hope you're familiar with the sort of centrality of his work, really kind of transformative in terms of how we think, not just about the revolution, but the way in which kind of ideas circulated and kind of movement of ideas in the period. And so as I was going through graduate school, the many conversations, and Julius has a way of kind of speaking these truths in these very kind of sharp ways, really interesting ways. So I think a lot of those conversations really shaped the possibility of thinking as I did in this book. It was Rebecca who in her courses really introduced me to then the core secondary work. Obviously David Gegas, who was then perhaps the most prominent historian working on this at the time, the work of Carolyn Fick, extremely essential monograph on the history of the Haitian Revolution. And first guided me as I began to do archival work. I had actually I was in a program in anthropology and history, and for a long time I actually thought I would do an anthropology thesis, an ethnographic thesis, and kind of move into the archival work. And also the centrality of teaching in this book was in some ways written to help kind of these things are taught. With Fernando in a modern Latin American history course, and to his credit, I think he sort of said, why don't we start and end with Haiti? Why don't we make this Haiti central to Latin America instead of at the margins of it? And so that experience sort of made me think in these terms. Also was lucky enough that Michel Reltrio came to Michigan to present a chapter, basically the chapter on Sans Souci from the book, The Silence in the Past, in an early draft version And I ended up at that event, and that was a huge sort of realizing now what that meant was to be there in that kind of discussion and debate as well. I didn't write about the Haitian Revolution in my thesis. I had good smart mentors who said, pick something smaller. So I literally picked something smaller, which is Guadeloupe, which is but doing that dissertation research, I did go into the archives of the Haitian Revolution, including the very famous, at least among historians of the Haitian Revolution, this D25 series, which is this extraordinary series that it would take lifetimes to go through in Paris. So while I was writing a book about Guadeloupe, a dissertation about Guadeloupe that became a book, I sort of had to sort of embed a history of the Haitian Revolution and kind of try to absorb that as much as possible. So that work ended up making an argument on the basis of the broadest argument of it was that modern ideas of universalism were in many ways crafted and shaped in the Caribbean during the Age of Revolution. So kind of arguing that any history of ideas about democracy and equality had to include and centrally engage with that history. So that was kind of a core point there, and it's a thing that comes up in this book in a different way. I was lucky enough in 1998 in France, was the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery, and I was able to publish a part of the dissertation, which is about a slave revolt in Guadeloupe in France. So that was kind of a first taste of and there in particular, this idea that the history of slavery was kind of central to thinking about contemporary politics came through in the discussions that I had about that book afterwards in Guadeloupe and elsewhere. When I began teaching Caribbean history at Michigan State University in 1999, that's when the idea of this started to percolate. I wanted to teach, of course, my students about this event. I was using the kingdom of this world, as many people do, as I had as teaching Latin American history. I think as others, I would assign the Black Jacobins to my undergraduate students and find it difficult for them, if you don't know who Barnave is or any of, these kinds of things. So there's a way in which that text, while I realized I could basically teach a course about that text, but it was hard to embed it in a kind of Michigan State classroom. So that was a kind of challenge. And it was at breakfast one day, Julius always reminds me that this was his fault, that in Ann Arbor I had breakfast with Julius and Ada, and was essentially asking them for advice, like how do you teach the Haitian Revolution, how do you, and complained that there wasn't a short English language history of the Haitian Revolution that I could use in my class. And Julius said, well, maybe you should write one, which I always try, I kind of remember as maybe you should stop whining and do something about it. So he kind of egged me on, and so did Ada. But the idea kind of took hold, and I thought, maybe this might be a good idea. Going back to that moment, I think it's also important because for those of you in this field, to think about the publication history, the space for publication for these. And it was striking to me that in I think Ada played a central role here. She published her book, Insurgent Cuba. And that book, I really realized when I was starting talking to editors, had opened up a space for publishing in Caribbean studies that really hadn't been there before. Even in my first book, which was eventually published at the Omaha Institute, the idea of is there even an audience for Caribbean studies? Like who's going to read these? Right? Was kind of present. Just as a little factoid, which is that I published my book with the Omaha Institute series which is part of UNC Press, but a long early American history series. And it was, in fact, the first book on the Caribbean published by them since Sugar and Slaves by Richard Dunn, which is from 1972, just to give you a sense of that delay. So since then, that has changed. But it's not that long ago, and yet the kind of idea of where is the space for Caribbean studies in the market, the academic marketplace was important. So I think Ada's book really changed that and began to sort of shift that. And I know that for a fact in part because when I went to Harvard Press, which had turned down Ada's book, they had kind of, I think, started to understand that there was maybe a space for this. My editor at Harvard Press was Joyce Seltzer, who had not really done works on the Caribbean before and was an ideal, in some ways, editor who saw the importance of the story but also wasn't familiar with it, so kind of pushed me to make it in a general way. So, in some ways I felt very lucky to be able to take this on, even though it was a daunting task, because the Haitian Revolution is basically, as I'm sure you'll all agree, the most interesting and dramatic thing to have ever happened in human history. So, I know I'm going to set this to the right room, but there was a way in which the core story here was inherently fascinating and dramatic, and the question was how kind of honor that drama in a certain way. The tradition of the Black Jacobins, obviously kind of was there and present, and it will always be the great book on the Haitian Revolution. But this idea that it was maybe okay to write a kind of dramatic epic for it. I wanted it to be epic in a sense. I felt like the story deserved. And I was writing this to some ways for an American reading public that I thought should know about this story. That it was basically a huge absence. If you didn't know this, you couldn't. In some ways, I sort of say you just can't understand the world without this story. So put it bluntly. What was interesting about trying to write it, and I think maybe we can talk about this with the other works as well, is trying to figure out how to work on multiple levels at the same time. And I think that's a general question to raise, I think, in academic or historical writing. How to write kind of multivalent texts, right, that work on different levels at the same time. I obviously wanted to intervene in debates about the Haitian Revolution. I wanted to sort of take stands and on certain aspects that I was familiar with in the historiography. And to present interpretive arguments about the causes and the links, in particular, this question of the French and Haitian revolutions, which I had been thinking about for some time, the questions of the contradictions of emancipation. But I wanted to write it in a way so that those who are familiar with those debates and interested in those debates would kind of know where I was standing on them and would see them as interventions, while people who had never even known that there was such a debate at all would also be able to read the book without feeling somehow excluded, right? So essentially trying to figure out how to do that was part of the challenges. And I'm thinking about the way that I'm trying to interpret the Black Jacobin ceremony, which has, about which there have been a lot written and debate about the sources, to tell the story and also raise the question of interpretation in the same way. One of the ways I did that was to make, and I wanted to sort of be, and very interpolated, of course, by Trio's demand that we think carefully about our archives, to make the question of the archive itself part of the book. So one of the ways I did that was to make Moreau de Saint-Méry, who's this kind of figure who sort of founds the way that many people think about Haiti, to make him a character in the book, right? So to make the story of him and his archives, which he lost at one point in his books, part of the story, so that in other words, so that the archives, the kind of production of the archives would be part of the story, but that the question of these people's perspectives and the fact that we write these histories in kind of tension with the planter vision would be part of it as well. So one of the things I realized consistently as I was writing it was that there was something terrifying. I mean, there were lots of things where I thought, I don't know if we really know what happened, during this period, right? And then I realized, that's okay, right? I'm going to do the best I can to try to provide a responsible, but in more than one cases, and this has been very true in the last 15 years, I thought, when someone really researches this, it will have to revise this. There's more to this than can be done, but one has to sort of go through these parts of the story. And I would say that notably about the whole period after the abolition of slavery and the kind of complexities on the island and so forth. So, what I did sort of hope, and this was something that Julius and Ada had said, was that to some extent, it helps the field to put something out there, even if it's just so people can attack it. So that to some extent, to have some sort of argumentation that people can then use to sort of connect with. It was clear to me by the time this book came out in 2004, so I wrote it sort of between 2001, 2002, and 2004. And it was published in 2004, of course, which is the bicentennial of the Haitian Revolution, and a period where lots of things happened around that. But it was very clear that people in Latin American history and U.S. history, had become increasingly aware that the Haitian Revolution was a gap, right? That there was an absence for it. And I had enough conversation with people who sort of said, I would enjoy teaching this if I could, but not to the extent that I would actually go teach Black Jacobins or something. But that there was a kind of interest in that. And that people needed a text to do it. So in this book, and then in a Bedford reader, a source reader that I did with John Garris a few years later, there was a sort of simple goal of putting things in the hands of people who had decided to do this but needed some help doing it. And as an additional hope, I had sort of thought, this is kind of conspiratorial, but I thought if undergraduates started reading about the Haitian Revolution, then some of them would become brilliant historians of the Haitian Revolution, which sort of happened in the sense that I was lucky enough to have three former graduate students here who at one point or another, not saying the text sort of affected them that deeply, but at one point encountered the text. But basically, on a bigger sense, the idea that one had to seed the field to some extent, like you have to kind of change the way undergraduate teaching works if you want to change the way that a field works, right? That you have to kind of change the undergraduate curriculum in order for people to be exposed to different ways of thinking. that then changes what they think about as a viable possibility in graduate training. So obviously the last 15 years there's been this amazing really expansion of the field in history and literary studies and performance studies and anthropology and critical theory. I think all kinds of work that has kind of pushed people to feel at least a little bit ashamed if they don't know a little bit about the Haitian Revolution, or feel some sense that like this is part of the kind of thing that you need to know about. And that's good, right? That's important. I knew we had won a kind of battle when I occasionally started hearing people say like, all anyone talks about is the Haitian Revolution. It's such a fad, which obviously is totally untrue. It's like when one immigrant arrives, it's too much. But there was a kind of a sense that at least this is a presence, right, that to be reckoned with. And I think that is extremely important. And I think obviously there's lots of things that have shaped that. I think that there's obviously there's a political charge to all this, the continuing sort of ways in which the representations of Haiti have a deep and negative impact on Haitian possibilities is very vivid, and I think a lot of people we're all driven by that sense that, and obviously this is true for the Caribbean and more broadly for the Afro-Atlantic world, but that representations matter, they have very concrete consequences, and that in a small way to sort of change the way that things are told can in fact have this broader effect. But I also think there's a recognition that I think, people, that I continue to believe that it should be true, that people understand the topic as vital for the ways in which it pushes us to rethink the very basic categories of knowledge and how we narrate history and organize the world. So the fact that the Haitian Revolution, as again James and many Haitian intellectuals have understood, is this fundamental challenge, right, to lots of ways that things are organized. And so that, I think, keeps drawing people to it, and it's in many ways the Haitian Revolution can be thought of as this incredible font, right, of ways of thinking and approaching the world. And to kind of honor it is to sort of take that seriously. So I'm really honored to be here today with Julia and Greg, both of whom has produced really transformative work in the field, and to think about the question of the Avengers specifically. The three of us all share a common connection to soccer, since Julia has taught with me my soccer class, and Greg, of course, is soccer player. So we can't promise that we'll somehow, I was thinking that we'll somehow talk about the impact of soccer on the Haitian Revolution, or some connection, but we'll try to contain that a little bit. We also were invited to think about the Avengers films and the relationship there to the Avengers. I have had the opportunity over the last 2 weeks to go through a crash course in Marvel movies with my son, who would not let me go see Avengers Endgame unless I had watched the entire corpus. So I have some thoughts, including Groot in particular. No spoilers. So no spoilers. I'm not going to spoil anything. It is true that this morning I've told my son that I think most things come from the Caribbean, like the Matrix. Obviously, it's basically just Rastafarianism, and it strikes me that Groot is maybe a version of the Dubois, who's like a Loire. And this morning, amazingly, my son said, that first scene in, sorry, I know this is really, have people seen them? That first scene in Guardians of the Galaxy 2, where there's this whole sequence where this whole battle happens behind Groot, who is just dancing to 70s music. It's a really delightful scene. And he said to me, he has a really good history teacher right now. He said to me, isn't that kind of like what you're trying to do, right? Where you're recentering the narrative. You don't focus on the sort of things that people traditionally would look at, but you look at something different. Yeah, I'm going to bring that up this time. Anyway, sorry, that's a little digression. Let me conclude a few thoughts about the image and trope of Avenger that the title came from. The title of the book was inspired by the crossroads between Louis-Sébastien Mercier and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and again, something that Greg has delved into much deeper than I did. But Louis-Sébastien Mercier wrote a book in the 1770s, which was a time travel book in which he travels into the hundreds of years into the future and kind of walks around, and the world has been much improved, essentially. He kind of lives in a utopian world. And one of the things that happens is he comes across a plaza with a big statue of a black man, kind of a proud, sort of general-looking figure, and underneath it says, "To the Avenger of the New World," right? And then when he asks people, who is this guy? Why do you have a statue to him? And they say, "Oh, that's the guy who led the uprising of the slaves, where they overthrew slavery and killed the masters and reestablished the rights of, natural rights in the world." And so we were grateful to this person who helped improve the world, and so we built a statue for him. So that idea that there would be, and this is published in 1771, right? So there would be a person to come who would avenge the New World, who would avenge America. Something that I later realized also is a kind of reference probably to Voltaire's plays in the 1730s, Alzire, in which there's an indigenous Avenger. But then at the end of the Revolution, and Dessalines, who Julia has written about so beautifully, has a famous statement where, in justifying the massacre of planters, he says, you know, I have paid back these true cannibals, crime for crime, outrage for outrage. I have avenged America, right? And so those two quotes, and that kind of, what struck me, I think, in particular was the temporality of this, right? The idea that there had long been this idea of an avenger, that there would someone would arise and eventually take on slavery, but that, of course, the form that the avenger took was something unpredictable, right? That the way that it actually went in the case of the Haitian Revolution was not something that anyone could have predicted. It went far beyond the prophecies in terms of depth, configuration, content, and all that happened in the revolution. And that in some ways the very play between the prophecy and its realization kind of condenses the power at the heart of a revolution, which is that it is always about imagining unimaginable futures and then making them not just unimaginable but real in some ways, by concretizing them. So I suppose that the Avenger for me still maintains a sense of the multiple and multi-directional temporalities that make up history, and are a reminder that the writing of history, like history itself, is always marvelously unfinished, and therefore a realm of possibility. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you to the Woodson Institute, to Marlena for inviting me, and also it's an honor to be here between these two people that I like very much. Whose writing has helped me personally very much. Julia, not so long ago, posted on Twitter sort of a question about Laurent's book, saying, when did you first read it? Which was an interesting question. I remember, as most people do, it turns out, exactly when I first read it. And for me, it was early on in grad school, just without telling the entire story of my life, I'm just going to give you a little background. I grew up and went to grad school in France, and then I moved to the US and went back to grad school eventually. But so I was in France. I was an English major specializing in American literature. And so in 1998, that same year, I was also in France and seeing France not celebrate their 150th anniversary of the actual abolition of slavery, because you know they did it twice. And so it's funny you mentioned, because it was an interesting turning point in France because nothing happened. And what did happen was really rare for France, a gathering of people of West Indian descent, demonstrations that, you know, from most people did not see, but that were really changing. It was very un-French in many ways. It was very un-French West Indian as well, to see these people in metropolitan France talking about themselves, let's say. And to this day, I mean now, identity politics have become the plague of old France in interesting ways. But so, what I mean by this is that my interest in Haiti was very personal in that way. It felt personal, you know, for I guess background reasons, but also because as an English major, I didn't think that was something I would ever study, you know, as a scholar. For one, you know, if anything, the language was French, so I didn't know how I would even include it. But second, in France, if you study American literature, that's what you do. It's a box, so it has to be English, it has to be from America. So it was nice when I came here to realize that they would apparently let me do whatever I wanted. That's what I wanted to do. This is what I did. And so I read Laurent's book the first time when I started. I was actually writing an essay on English representations of Toussaint Louverture, and some of the work that went into the Marcus Rainsford edition that you had earlier. And so I was interested in the ways English writers during the Revolution, especially after British troops withdrew from the island in 1798, propped up Louverture and developed a heroic vision of it, right, which I thought was really peculiar. And to me what was interesting was that this was in writing, but also in visual culture. You know, there are images, go back quickly. Well, there's this one, of course, that I'd known for years without actually knowing where it came from. also these images I suspect you may have seen before because they're fairly classic images in relation to the Haitian Revolution. And so they appear in this way. And so about Laurent's book, again, it may go, and you mentioned it already, but it may go without saying in 2019 with Avengers Endgame in the theater, that you might make the connection with Marvel superheroes, but I grew up reading them because I'm a big nerd like that, and so I always made that connection. So when I did first see his book, that is a thing I very much thought about, even though it wasn't cool back then. I'm not sure it is cool now, but I say this half as a joke, but also because to me, there is a pop culture connection between the two. It was clear to me, even though it wasn't necessarily there, it didn't necessarily make sense. But it was funny to think about also. If you think of the heroes of the Haitian Revolution, and if they are the Avengers, then which one might they be? Well, that's an interesting game if you want to play it later. Is it just Captain America? That'd be interesting. Pierrot as Iron Man.
Oh my gosh.
Tony Stark, yeah. The idea was they can't all be Black Panther, except they are, right? And I say this again, half as a joke, but also fairly seriously. That's part of what I talk in the book. They are all Black Panther in a way, and not just because Black Panther is the most recent. Not just because he's an Avenger, but also because he's one of the most recent variation on a line of Black Avenger. And very much the same line evoked in Laurent's book and others. The full title, of course, Avengers of the New World, the story of the Haitian Revolution. The plural here is important to me, I'll get back to that. This is also a title that packs quite a lot of information. It is a genealogy, an invitation to reflect on the ways we structure our stories about history. And for the matter at hand today, it turns out it had a lot to do with pop culture. Or in any case, something like what pop culture might have been in the 18th century. It refers to the peculiar process by which, as he gained widespread recognition for his achievements as a military leader, Toussaint Louverture came to be seen in the guise of figures that had already been introduced in fiction. So I'm not going to go over that again. Laurent mentioned Mercier and Renan, texts that were fairly widely read, and that presented sort of the figure that then people proceeded or decided to recognize in Toussaint Louverture. Renan, notably, in one of the many editions of his book, warned of the coming of a black Spartacus who would rise and flip the colonial order on its head, submitting whites to the treatment they needed on black. And I always like this text because it's sort of the ultimate proof for all those people who think, well, that's the way people thought in the 18th century, people were fine with slavery. Yeah, they knew, right? And it's fairly obvious everybody knew what kind of moral issue that might be. And so, of course, they bring the theme of revenge, which is dear to me, but we're going to talk about more, I'm sure. But so Laurent returns to this motif throughout the book in quotes and epigraphs, the quotes he mentioned by Dessalines, other references to Renan, direct or indirect, and so that famous quote, "I've saved my country, I have avenged America," which always made me think also, I mean, you tend to define Napoleon as the ultimate Byronic hero, but I mean, Dessalines sort of very much endorses that position as well. I think he enjoys at some point being the terror of the White West in very literary ways, I should think. So reading Laurent's book made clear to me how and why this phrase remains striking to this day, the idea of the Avenger of the New World. The original French texts were written in a prophetic tone, and the Revolution in some way seemed to confirm them. And in this sense, the phrase was always future-oriented and remains so. And I think that speaks to what you were just saying about the temporality of it. Dessalines' appropriation of it and all the codes it tapped into, even as it seemed to put an end to the initial process of revenge, right? I mean, they seem to have won, it should be over. It also gestures to that horizon evoked in Mercier, right? I mean, first Haiti, and then maybe the world, even though, as Julia might talk about today, but I certainly talked in her books, we know part of the contract of early independent Haiti was actually to say we will not spread the revolution. You can't control ideas, right? It's the want of cultural motifs to escape their originators in this sense. And Dessalines may not have had the whole world in mind, but there was space in his words to imagine that worldwide Black Revolution might actually happen. All this threat was packed in an outsized great men of history, right? This setting sort of embodied this threat in this sense. And so, to me, the arc that connected the 18th century Avenger of the New World to Marvel's Avengers, and all Black Panther, with all that he evokes of 20th century Black revolutionary movements, seemed actually clear, right? When I first started reading this book, it seemed that, it was a small epiphany of sorts, right? To me, there's a line there that didn't necessarily seem as obvious to me before. I didn't necessarily have all stations in mind, how we got from one point to the next, or the episodes in between, but I've grown up reading comic books and watching exploitation movies as well. Know how Black revolt can look cool, culturally, even as it is quashed politically, which, again, I think is part of what the book alludes to. So I was struck rather deeply by how much Black Panther's origin story, the superhero, echoed elements of literature's story, or at least the way it was portrayed, notably by English people, as I mentioned before, but also visually. Just put that back on. I found this one. I thought it was pretty funny, but really there are others. And visuals, again, are important, if only for something we were just talking about earlier. Not everybody reads, certainly not in the 18th century, but anybody can look at images, and we know from Julius and from other texts that information traveled orally, but also through images at that time, so I think that's not unimportant. English news at the time routinely implied that Louverture was descended from African royalty, and they made a point of saying that, even though they really had no way of knowing that. It was just part of that story. Something that was both somewhat trifling and to me very important, Rainsford's Toussaint Louverture makes Black revolt look sexy, not unlike the Black Panther makes Black power look fun. And in both cases, there's a fairly clear connection to the politics of the time, but also misdirection. And so how and why that might work in a country whose wealth was predicated on the slave trade sort of baffled me. Why would Great Britain at that point, I mean, there are political reasons, but why would they run that risk of maybe making this man look enticing? But that wasn't unfamiliar, right? Black Panther, the superhero, first came about mere months before Black Panther as the political party officially formed. It worked in fairly similar ways to what I just mentioned, even though Stanley and Jack Kirby always said that their character had nothing to do with the Black Panther Party, it was nevertheless tapping into a moment where the civil rights movement was turning towards Black power politics. It is part of a process that mirrors cues and silences, right? The Black Panther, the superhero, evokes Black power politics, but also turns away from them. And so I did what superhero nerds in the house might recognize, right, as a natural thing. When I was confronted with this Black Avenger, I figured I should look into his origin story. So this is what I did. And so for all I can know about the 20th century, what the book ended up doing is looking into what led Renal and Mercier to write about that character in the first place. Laurent and other authors like James, Laurent Sparcelesi, who works on Mercier, or Srinivas Aravamudan in Tropical Politics had already looked into those roots. Aravamudan connected him to the unavoidable figure of Orinoco, the enslaved African prince written by Afra Ben in 1688, and a legacy of modern European representations of noble blackness. Yet what I thought was a deciding element that deserved more attention in that genealogy was the one pushed forward in Laurent's title, and that was revenge. That connection with Orinoco has been brought up before, but it's rare that people think of revenge in connection with Orinoco. I'm not going to belabor the point, but it's actually there. And here again, it's there only to sort of be stepped aside from. There's something about revenge that ties all of these themes together. Superheroes, revolution, who gets to exercise violence in politics and be praised for it, and who gets to be portrayed as a monster, how, when, by whom, and to what end. Revenge is one of the oldest and most lasting plots in culture. For the theorist René Girard, it is an essential dynamic of human society. He thinks that religion and later legal systems historically rise to break the cycle of revenge, and that cycles tend to start again in moments of great societal crisis, like revolutions. So concern with revenge is age-old. but it is also much more specific here, right? It's concerned with Black revenge in the modern context of the triangular trade and its aftermath. And so the hunch I started developing around reading Laurent's book is that we summon revenge in complex, strategic ways when we tell stories about history. I found that the fear of Black Revolution found in Renard and Mercier existed in slightly different forms in earlier texts as well. Before Orinoco, there were the Black villains of English revenge drama. They tend to be evil Africans bent on setting the world on fire, but only because someone killed their father and stole their kingdom. So if anybody's seen Black Panther, that might ring your bell also, not by chance. If you think of Killmonger, he is, again, also one in a line of characters that are at least 4 centuries old, since Europeans started kidnapping Africans to sell them into American bondage. And ever since then, it served as a kind of screen on which to project anxieties, trial exorcisms, and what have you. Also crucially, and I'm talking about the figure of the Black Avenger, is routinely served to negate what I believe is the heart of that anxiety, and that is collective political Black agency. What I posit in the book is that when we talk about Black political agency, the figure of the glorious Black Avenger is one of the most ubiquitous and insidious ways in which we turn away from collective agency, from politics that is, to enter individual fiction. And so I don't want to take too much time here, and I'll conclude by returning to the title of Laurent's book. As I mentioned, he talks about Avengers in the plural. And we know one of the struggles in telling the story of history, arguably, is to eschew the narrative structures we're beholden to. In Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James struggles out loud with this. He wants to tell the history of the Haitian people, but he ends up focusing too much on ouverture in substance. Not by chance does he present it, at some point in that very famous passage, in theatrical terms, with Louverture as a tragic hero and the people as the chorus. I think the matter of representation, his storytelling is what's always in front of us, right? And to me, that's been and remains a journey in figuring out how we can tell the story of the Avengers without making them superheroes, or rather possibly with recognizing that their superpower might be to actually work together. And so I think in this way, the horizon on the field and work that Julia has been doing, and I think she might be talking about is precisely this, right? To give the space not just to the revolution as an extraordinary event, but the revolution as politics and the Constitution and all the politics that come after this endpoint of the revolution. I think works that certainly I got into thanks to this book, and I think you mentioned where the field is going. I believe, hopefully, this is where it is going. So maybe if we don't figure out how to save the world today, we can talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you to the Woodson Institute and to Marlena for having us here and for providing the space for this wonderful conversation. I similarly remember meeting Marlena at the HSA in 2008. And my memory is that I was just awestruck by Marlena, particularly by her scholarship and her storytelling abilities, and this is an awe that remains a decade later. So it's just such a joy to collaborate with you. I was gonna laugh that the article that I wrote that you had up there earlier in the conversation. The editor insisted that Thomas Jefferson be in the title because nobody cared about Haiti. And I kind of grudgingly accepted, however, I thought that maybe here it was appropriate. So we could emphasize that. So Avengers of the New World was the second book that I read about the Haitian Revolution. C.L.R. James beat you to it. But it was only because your book wasn't out yet. So I read it as soon as it came out. And basically my entire career has been shaped by Laurent's teachings, even before I met him, and it continues to be today. And as I reread the book in preparation for this celebration, I found myself highlighting new sections and focusing on new arguments. It's a book that has stood the test of time and is no less relevant today than when it first came out. One of my favorite things about the book, and that Laurent also articulated today, is that it's a conversation. Sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, And in the introduction, Laurent tells us, quote, "This is a story that deserves and indeed demands to be told and retold." And this was one of the most important lessons that I learned from Laurent as a scholar. I heard him say on several occasions, you know, it's okay to have more than one book about the Haitian Revolution. Right? He emphasizes the benefits of the scholarly conversation and, as Marlena said, bringing people to the table. His scholarship was never selfish, but instead insisted that our responsibility was to the ancestors. So today I'm going to put some of the themes that Laurent discusses in Avengers in conversation, because I've been thinking a lot about them in the context of writing a biography of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Haiti's first head of state. And it just shows how relevant this book still is. So I will repeat the quotation that we've already said, but it's okay, it's a good one. In his April 28, 1804 speech, so I refer to the April 28th speech throughout, Dessalines proclaimed, "Yes, we have paid these true cannibals back, crime for crime, war for war, outrage for outrage. Yes, I have saved my country, I have avenged America." The speech has been understood as a justification for the recent executions that Dessalines ordered after he discovered a conspiracy to overthrow his government in the early months of 1804. And our understanding of Dessalines' vengeance has focused primarily on violence. But as Laurent told us 15 years ago, and has continued to tell us in the years since, we need to take the intellectual and political contributions of the Haitian Revolution more seriously. As he argued in Avengers, I'm just going to quote you back to yourself repeatedly. These events represented the most radical political transformations of the age of revolution that stretched from the 1770s to the 1830s. But I'm not sure we need to separate these two issues. I think there's a reason to consider vengeance and politics together, but not necessarily focusing on physical violence. And this is especially important to consider since the violence of slavery was expressed in a range of ways: physical, but also emotional and intellectual. So what does vengeance for these types of traumas look like? And so today I'll open the conversation by focusing on the violence of dislocation in the Atlantic system of slavery, and how Haitians avenged this assault in their radical politics. I'll focus on the body of evidence produced by Dessalines, but upon which later leaders kind of expanded and modified. So in response to the violence of dislocation, Dessalines avenged the injustices of slavery with a radical politics of belonging, in which he imagined an American homeland for the dispossessed. In thinking about this, I'll propose 5 topics, which I hope we can discuss further together as a group. The first is eternal hatred to France. The second are the borders of the nation. The third, the idea of free soil. The fourth is citizenship. And the fifth is indigeneity. And so I'll offer a few pieces of evidence, a series of quotations for each of us just to get us started. So first, eternal hatred to France. The theme comes from the Declaration of Independence, in which Dessalines declared, "Peace to our neighbors, but anathema to the French name. Eternal hatred to France, that is our cry." By creating an everlasting them, Dessalines minimized the differences within the Haitian community. Haitians were not French. The othering of the French allowed people of different nations, races, ethnicities, and linguistic groups to come together in opposition. This everlasting hatred had a practical arm, and in the April 28th speech, Dessalines declared, "Never again shall a colonist or a European set his foot upon this territory with the title of master or proprietor." This rule remained in place for over 100 years. Together, these two anti-French or anti-European statements created an anti-colonial space, even though he was willing to establish trade relations with slaveholding empires, and it perpetuated the stimulus that brought together many of the different groups in the final fight for independence. Okay, so I moved between them pretty quickly, so because I don't want to end any of the topics. So the second, the borders of the nation. The issue of establishing borders, I think, has 2 parts. The first one is firm borders for some. the tyrants, usurpers, and scourges of the New World, as he called them. And against them, the army would protect the country. But Haitians could also rely on environmental or supernatural forces to defend. And again, from the April 28th speech, Dessalines argued that, quote, the irritated genius of Haiti, rising out of the bosom of the ocean, appears. Its menacing aspect throws the waves into commotion, excites tempests, and with its mighty hand disperses ships or dashes them in pieces. To its formidable voice, the laws of nature pay obedience. Diseases, plague, famine, conflagration, poison are its constant attendants. The borders were impenetrable. For some. For others, they were fluid and open. Dessalines wanted to repatriate many of the formerly enslaved people that the French colonists had taken with them when they fled the island at different points during the Revolution. He published a note in American newspapers to secure their safe return. Quote, the Governor General, Dessalines, considering that a large number of blacks and men of color endure in the United States all sorts of deprivations because they do not have the means to return to Haiti, decrees that each American ship captain will be reimbursed $40 for every individual that they return to the country. Dessalines also tried to arrange for the return of Haitians in Jamaica and the migration of blacks and people of color from Martinique and Guadeloupe. But the open border only worked one way. So I don't want to reduce the complexity and seeming contradictions of Dessalines' policies. Haitians were not allowed to leave. In October 1804, Dessalines issued a law prohibiting foreign merchants from transporting any indigène from the island. If a foreign captain was caught with a Haitian citizen on board his ship, and his intention was to take that person to a foreign country, the captain would be imprisoned for 10 months and then banished from the country forever. The Haitian would be shot in a public place. So firm borders, open borders, and one-way borders, depending on who you're talking about. The third, free soil. In the Declaration of Independence, Dessalines called Haiti the territory of liberty and the empire of liberty in the country that gave us birth. In his 1805 Imperial Constitution, he proclaimed in Article 1, the people inhabiting this island, previously called Saint-Domingue, will form a free state, État libre, sovereign and independent of all other powers in the universe, under the name of the Empire of Haiti. And in Article 2, just in case it wasn't clear, he declared slavery is forever abolished. In the April 28th speech, he made clear that anyone who threatened these principles would die. These declarations, paired with the previous themes, migration strategies, set the stage in a lot of ways for the 1816 constitutional revision of the Republic of Haiti in the South and West that was the subject of Adafreur's amazing AHR article. Specifically, Article 44 of the Constitution declares all Africans, Indians, and the descendants of their blood born in foreign colonies or countries who come to reside in the Republic will be recognized as Haitians, but will enjoy the rights of citizenship only after 1 year of residence. Arriving in Haiti meant freedom. Number 4, citizenship. The first words of Dessalines' proclamation in the Declaration of Independence is citoyen. And this in and of itself should be understood as a part of the radical politics of the revolution. Universal citizenship, especially at a time when citizenship as it related to the nation state was still being sorted out. The title of the proclamation is the General-in-Chief to the People of Haiti, but he doesn't open with the people of Haiti, he emphasizes their new political identity. In doing so, he asserted the significance of their rights and of their equality. These he more clearly articulated in the 1805 Constitution. For example, Article 3, Haitian citizens are brothers at home. Equality before the eyes of the law is unquestionably recognized, and there cannot exist other titles, advantages, or privileges but those that necessarily result from the consideration and reward of the services rendered to liberty and independence. This version of citizenship remained patriarchal and masculine, but it's a clear attempt to reduce the axis of difference within the population. A strategy that pairs well with the emphasis on the other in the first theme, right? Paternal hatred difference. This article complements the most famous article from the 1805 Constitution, number 14, in which differences of color within the Haitian family are ended and all Haitians will be called black. When a person became a Haitian citizen, they had to, and here I'll quote from a naturalization certificate, quote, Take an oath to renounce France forever, to live and die under the laws emanating from our authority, to never undertake, directly or indirectly, against the legitimate power, and to contribute with all their strength in every way to the conservation and the prosperity of the island of Haiti, to which they become, by the present document, the adoptive child and interested member. As Laurent told us in Avengers, quote, if we live in a world in which democracy is meant to exclude no one, it is in no small part because of the actions of those slaves in Saint-Domingue who insisted that human rights were theirs too. And finally, 5, indigeneity. Dessalines' use of the word indigenous, his army was the Armée Indigène, and in the Declaration of Independence, the citizens, in one instance, are called citoyens indigènes. He also earlier used the expression for his army, the sons of the Inca. The Oath of Independence in the Declaration refers to the indigène d'Haïti, right? Doubly significant because, of course, the name Haiti was the name used by the indigenous Taino inhabitants of the island. These names, Laurent tells us, are important because it was, quote, an attempt to assert a legitimate claim to a land in which a majority of the nation's inhabitants were exiles, having been brought there from Africa against their will. But it also suggested that this claim was based on residence, too, and the ultimate victory over the brutality of colonialism, something which the enslaved shared with those wiped out by the Spanish centuries before they arrived. This shared experience, I suspect, and possibly Dessalines' amplification of it, may have led to the inclusion in Article 44 of the 1816 Constitution that I quoted before, of the Indians and their descendants. Indigenous people from anywhere in the Americas would be welcomed as citoyens indigènes of Haiti. So in bringing this all together, Dessalines' government in Haiti articulated in correspondence, in laws, and proclamations the most expansive and revolutionary definition of citizenship in the Age of Revolution by creating an idealized homeland for indigenous people and people of African descent in the Americas. To do this, he ideologically linked the enslaved, the indigenous, through their shared experiences as the victims of colonialism. In Dessalines' Haiti, all Haitians were free and all Haitians were black, regardless of the color of their skin. Dessalines opened the borders and offered refuge for the downtrodden of the Americas. Citizenship was available for the disenfranchised, the displaced, and the stateless. If we think about all of these things together, Haiti becomes not just a source of hope, of escape, or of possibility, but a place of belonging, to which every person in the African and indigenous diasporas could participate, either in person or in spirit. Haiti was not just for Haitians, and by creating this hemispheric sense of belonging and victory, can we understand Dessalines' politics as having similarly avenged America?
So I have a question for the panel that I've given to them in advance, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you. So the question that I have primed them with, and I'm hoping they'll have some interesting answers, is that in Haitian studies we've asked the question, why is there no Hollywood movie about the Haitian Revolution or Toussaint Louverture? Like, isn't this, this is like everything that you need for a movie, right? And I started thinking about it, and sort of the stock response is, well, nobody wants to see, people in the United States don't want to see black people killing white people on stage. Like, it would just make them too uncomfortable, like righteously doing so, right? But actually, I thought about it, and that's actually, if that's true, a much more recent phenomenon, right? Because Caliban in The Tempest was an extremely popular play. Orinoco was played and adapted all over the world. And even in the early 20th century, the Haitian Revolution, playing it on stage and theater, was immensely popular. Dessalines, Christophe, Toussaint Louverture. I'm thinking also of Eugene O'Neill's The Emperor Jones. So this wasn't a foreign idea. So where are we in the idea of being able to accept a Black Avenger as a historical fact rather than as an abstraction or a metaphor or a fictional character, as in the Black Panther, which we seem very willing to accept as long as the person is not real? Okay, so that's the question.
Oh, that's a great question.
Well, thank you.
So, it's not Hollywood, but French TV produced, not so good.
Very, very painful.
It is very painful. So it's happening, but I'm pretty sure there's one that's actually in production in a series. And I mean, the problem is always whether or not they're actually going to see it through. Because we know that Danny Glover has been trying for like 25 years. So I mean, this one may come, we'll see. And I mean, I think we may hope that movies like Night Panther actually make a difference, right? Because I have to think that the difference between those plays and a potential movie beyond the millions of dollars that they represent is that you won't see that many white saviors, really. I mean, that's gonna be difficult. But at the same time, we have, I mean, if we think in fairly pressing commercial terms, we do have Jordan Peele. We have people who demonstrated that it doesn't have to matter quite the same way as it used to. We'll see.
Go ahead, my voice is recovering.
No, I thought you had the answer to this. You said earlier that you had the answer to this.
Well, to me, it's the politics of it. It's not the violence. It's that a movie, I think, popularizing a movie about the Haitian Revolution kind of disrupts the dominant narratives of where we think our modern values come from, right? And that it would kind of make us question our kind of obsession with American founding fathers as being the source of all equality, and instead highlight that in fact that is not the source of all equality, and maybe we should look elsewhere. And so in some ways, yeah, and then I think there's a question about the kind of access to the maintenance of hierarchies, local and global hierarchies that our society continues to perpetuate. And so there's an invested interest in not promoting things that would challenge the hierarchies that remain and that are legacies of the Haitian Revolution and before.
I mean, the story of this miniseries, I don't know, has anyone seen this? Have you seen it? Anyone else? The miniseries in France that was made, it's actually very telling because the story of this was that Raoul Peck wrote the original screenplay. Yeah. So Raoul Peck was asked to write it, and he began writing it, and at a certain point he realized, he talked about this at the Haitian Studies, but that he realized that the producers were going to do something kind of awful. Like, in other words, he basically realized that he couldn't really put his name on what they were going to end up doing, you know. And so he withdrew from it, but they, of course, owned his script, right? And if you watch the movie, it's really weird because it's awful in all kinds of ways, and then there are these really great dialogues. There's these moments where, like, very interesting things that Toussaint says about politics that are really smart, which are essentially the leftovers of Raoul Peck's stuff, I think. I mean, and then side by side, there's like this depiction of the Guacamole ceremony, which is like the worst, like Tintin au Congo kind of thing, you know, with a kind of guy who's like, I mean, anyway, you know, it's like there's this real destruction. It's like interesting that they couldn't really. I mean, we screened it at Duke, and it was actually really interesting because the way that some Haitians responded very positively. I mean, there's this kind of, because to some extent, just the fact of having it on screen, you know, the same as with Black Panther, right, the sort of just the fact of it. But I do think that it's a really interesting problem, like why it's so hard to tell that story cinematically. I mean, it is one that Julius, when he used to lecture on this, would always start from that problem. And you know, I mean, Danny Glover got money from Chavez at one point. I mean, there's been the saga after saga of people trying to get this, and it's been in the works for all this time. So anyway,
there's actually a movie. There's a hidden Haitian Revolution movie out there that played in theaters. It's a movie about how hard it is to make a movie about the Haitian Revolution. It's a top 5 Chris Rock's movie. The main character in the movie, I think Alyssa Sepinwall actually written the piece about this. But the main character in the movie, played by Chris Rock, is a comedian who has made a movie about the Haitian Revolution, and he's trying to promote it. It's called Uprise with a Z. It's sort of a weird Haitian Revolution because he plays like Boukman Dutty. It's like you only see like
That's
pieces of it. But it's basically him like going around trying to
And nobody
get
wants
people to
to
watch
watch
it.
it.
Nobody wants to watch it.
That's very interesting. But I do think, I mean, and I, obviously I think the configurations that seem to be changing around a lot of things seem, that we would maybe not have expected some time ago. So it's interesting. But I do also think the story itself has, demands a certain kind of telling. I mean, you can have Sontonax, you could put a few white people in there to sort of assuage the.
They were nice, right? I mean, levels of the
Yeah,
buddy.
they're buddies, they have buddies, No, but, so.
I wonder if it's easier to sell on Dessalines, because you can really Frenchicize
Yes, yeah, I think that's right.
Toussaint completely.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
it's really revolution, but it's still French. But you could make that up.
Right, he saves his master.
Well, Dessalines you can't.
But the ending is the problem.
But
problem
that's,
is
yeah,
that
that's
it's a
what that
tragedy.
movie is.
The
Well,
problem is that Dessalines is the real hero,
Dessalines.
depending on who you talk about.
Well, yeah, but I mean, Toussaint dies in France, you could portray it as Napoleon's excesses. There are plenty of ways of having a Toussaint. Dessalines, you can't deal with it because of what you just said.
It's a thing that we've discussed this before too, but so very interesting fact is the fact that 20th century Haitian writers, very, very few have written about the Haitian Revolution. There are some, like, Figures ou Tonki, there's a few that come at it really from some kind of direction. You could think that it's embedded really only like Marie de Chauvet dans Sur le Volcan deals with the revolution and kind of directly, which is also fascinating, right? That even in fiction it sort of poses some kind of interesting, so there's problems, right? And I think it has paradoxes and problems, and it has to do with how you represent Haiti in a kind of larger sense.
Because I'm always amazed at how Hollywood can co-opt anything.
Yeah, I know, you
I
would think they'd be able
mean,
to
people
co-opt
have Che Guevara on their thing. Toussaint would not be problematic.
Yeah.
Dessalines might be.
Has anyone ever approached you about optioning this for?
A few times I've had conversations with people about, but it's interesting. I mean, I won't tell you, but there's a kind of it's not that people don't think about it and think that it would be a great idea, right? It's just that it's sort of, they run into these kinds of, anyway, it's interesting.
I wonder why, I mean, I don't find no harm to ask this question, but I don't know why, whenever something just beams into my brain unbidden, I just think, why did that come unbidden? And that was Django Unchained.
Yeah.
And so,
Right.
which is, this crazy revenge fantasy, right? And so again, what's imaginable about, I mean, it's not a revolution clearly, but what is imaginable about indulging a revenge fantasy about slavery? That's happened. Am I remembering that? Is that
And part of it is the
Tarantino.
the humor and kind of kitschiness of it, I think. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, that would be
there's a
one
side
of
to it that sort of feels like, and I think it was very comfortable for white audiences. for
Okay,
interesting
that
reasons.
makes it, that's.
And that, I don't know, at least people have written about that to some extent, but
I haven't seen any treatments of it.
I mean, and it came out about the same time as 12 Years a Slave, which is the other
Yes, that is
thing to
true.
think about them together, I think is really interesting. But that's what I mean, by I do think things are changing.
Yeah, but there is a way in which you don't quite take it seriously. It's almost caricatured, as I recall that film, Django Unchained. It's a caricature.
And it's fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, well.
Just to address this, this New York Times review had come out when Django came out, and we sort of saying, oh, we've never seen this before, but even that's not true. We've seen this very often. I mean, we've seen this for 200, well, over, at this point, in 400 years on stage, black characters who slaughter left and right. I mean, people have always been fine. I mean, again, to me, they're fine with it, and that goes back to what you were saying. The problem with the Haitian Revolution is that it is political. I mean, you get hundreds of black people slaughtering white people, they don't care. That's entertaining, right? But if you get to, again, I think people would be fine with it. But if you get to talk about what they do, as political people, then that becomes a problem. And I don't think you can. I mean, they tried. I mean, that French, it's only 2 movies. It's regrettable in many ways, but they make an effort. But it's childish, right? I mean, the way they deal with the politics is just, it doesn't work.
The example is Burn, there's this film Burn, right? Which I remember people saying, there is a film about the Haitian Revolution, it's Burn, except it's a film about a white person started creating, and I thought, that's what, so it's really interesting, right? And very talented filmmakers, got Marlon Brando in it, you can imagine that it's more a film about Vietnam in the end than it actually is about the Haitian Revolution. Sorry,
Yeah. No, I was wanted to ask you, Laurent, about Marvel as Rastafarianism.
Yeah.
Maybe, and then connecting it back, because then, thinking about other kind of Caribbean models, could we tell a story about Haitian Revolution, right, in kind of the tone of Rastafarianism, or even connecting, right, kind of Caribbean uprisings, Caribbean revolutions that are fundamentally like pro-Black, fundamentally kind of anti-Western, right? So is there a Rastafari connection perhaps in an imaginary movie about the Haitian Revolution, and perhaps a little bit more about why Matrix as Rastafari?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, if you think, there's obviously very easy codes in the Matrix, right? Sort of Zion.
Yeah.
There's a sort of series of things, but just this idea, and in Marvel films too, actually. Right?
Yeah.
Kind of it is striking that the villain in the Marvel movie is always the military-industrial complex, basically, right? And the way in which the Nazis end up infiltrating the American. There's this kind of, you could call it that the enemy is coloniality, although they never put it that way. But there is this interesting way, right, in which the kind of certain kinds of machineries of control that are totalizing, et cetera, are consistently, and then the heroes are those who kind of can escape that kind of enslavement, let's put it that way, to those sort of systems through, and then as individuals, now it's interesting, it always tends to become individual heroism, the idea of collective heroism, and that might be kind of the issue. Then how do you make the collective the heroic?
Yeah, and so that might be the one answer, right? To kind of not tell the story from Toussaint Gisèle's perspective, right? So who would kind of be a chorus, right? Kind of James's, who would be a chorus? If you think about kind of the underlying principles, right, of revolution that then emerge in the Caribbean, again, not the kind of the American version, right? Which would be kind of collective, ground up. Is there a way we could imagine a Rastafari version? Right?
You got an answer.
Yeah.
When I have I have an exercise with my students, which is like the treatment for a movie on the Rape Revolution, and the question is always who's the main character in the Haitian Revolution? And I think the most interesting response is usually it has to be a woman on a plantation you've never heard of, who then makes decisions about, in relationship to this revolution, participates, right? That would be
or witnesses, right? Or just kind of Forrest Gump, kind of witnessing.
Witnessing or just going through, right? And that's kind of an interesting, right? In other words, that might be a short circuit to this other sort of thing, right? And I think that's interesting to, rather than the person, right? Because if you ask the question, who is actually the main character in the Haitian Revolution, in some ways that is the person, right? That multiplied by lots and lots of people is why it happened. The leaders are not the ones who created it, right? So that's a.
Since we're actually sharing our thoughts that we've had over dinner, we should talk about other times on how
this is a common.
I think one of the editorial or the questions that would need to get answered is the Haitian Revolution is 13 years long.
Yeah.
And a lot of these successful historical films that have come out recently, I'm thinking of Lincoln, for example, encapsulates the tensions of the Civil War in one moment, in one set of conflicts that it's temporally contained. It's not trying to tell the history of the war from its origins to its aftermath. And films that try to have that sweeping scope end up bleeding out into generalities and sort of losing its narrative tension and sort of the epic nature that sort of you pointed out too earlier. So either Game of Thrones, multiple protagonists, interlocking plot lines, 8 series, either that or...
I talked to someone who was thinking about that.
That's
we need a mini-series.
Yeah, no, a long mini, an HBO style. And then, or figuring out which moment of interpersonal conflict best represents the larger set of issues. And then that would also itself be a political decision.
Right.
But I think that would be one of the approaches.
But I also wonder, speaking to some of the points that have been made, I wonder to what extent this is about sort of our comfort level with ceding the kind of white states' monopoly on violence. I feel like we are very comfortable with figures like Django or Black Panther, who are essentially black paramilitaries, like Django works with a white bounty hunter. Black Panther is working with the white CIA agent. So I feel like maybe what it is that, right? That the imagination around actually ceding the state's monopoly on violence to black people is something that is kind of unimaginable.
Well, Thomas Gutierrez Alea kind of did that in the Última Cena in The Last Supper.
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
not a Hollywood film.
Yeah.
But it's not, yeah, but they don't take control of the state, and they end up, then they have all, their heads cut off in the end,
that's
so,
right. Right. But I mean,
all is restored in the end, right?
Sunny and then Jim.
So, again, this extends the conversation. This is a rephrasing of Dr. Delta's question and or reiteration of one of your questions, Dr. Pierrot, which was who gets to exercise violence in politics and history and is praised for it. Like, could you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's the same conversation, right? I think, to go back to, because I talk about Django, I talk about, other representations. And when it's okay, or it's been okay to see black individual characters, more often than not, doing certain feats of violence. And, there are variations, but usually it's okay when they're going to die. And when nothing they do has any political impact. And routinely in every one of these characters, one way or another, they're in a position at one point where they're about to lead an actual movement. But everybody else is unworthy. It's always the same. Right? Either they're natural aristocrats and the mass is just a bunch of groveling, cowards that run at the last minute, and so they die for that. Or it lasts for a second and they die for that anyway, but they always die, right? I mean, you'll find exceptions, but that is the tradition. And so we're completely fine with this, as a society, because the outcome is always the same, right? And it's exciting and it's elating, and everybody knows that the morals of it are right. We know why they're in revolt, we know why they use violence, but it's essential that they can succeed. Right? Because if they succeed, well then, everything else we talked about has to come into play. Right? Now you have to be fine with, with the massacres you're fine with, whether it's France or the US or England or wherever, but, I mean, socially speaking, we're on the other, like the culture's on the other side. So you have to be ready to recognize that this was warranted, and that can't happen. And so ultimately, I mean, I don't think it's a conspiracy, but I think the obstacle with those movies is that, right? Like if you let that be made in that way, and that's the other thing. As an aside with Louverture is that even you're right. They could totally make that movie. He dies anyway, right? It's nice.
Right.
It has to be tragic.
Yeah, the French version is one of those biopics, where they start at the end and then keep jumping back, and then the end, he's already dead.
You're reassured from the beginning.
So it's great. Well, yeah, but it's different.
Everybody dies.
Well, no, but when he's assassinated before.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think
But I
that's
wonder
the
if
same
it's
kind
who's
of.
responsible for the death matters.
I don't think you would have a hard time selling to an American audience the idea that the Haitian Revolution ultimately ended in failure.
Right. Okay.
Well, that's why.
That's why where you end is so important. So for my final exam yesterday, I had my students do how they would pitch a movie of the Amistad Rebellion, and they had to make it historically accurate. But within that, and so many of them did the miniseries ideas, but a lot of them did something, what you were suggesting, Claire, like, let's just pick one moment. We don't want to talk about the Supreme Court. Let's make it so that abolitionists cannot be the heroes here by ending the film with the success of the rebellion. So I wonder, can we start with, the war within the war, and then there's, the unification around getting rid of the French, and when they drive the French out of the island, you just end with, the Declaration of Independence and, bomb. Sounds good to me,
That would be the
right?
American
But
version.
why would you want to do it that way? Because Haiti is in a mess. I mean, this is also truncating history in a mystifying way.
But
Because
then you get
history
the
is also
divide
all of
between
those
the Cold
divisions,
War and-
all of the nastiness, all of the violence that existed among the revolutionaries. I mean, that's what Haitian nationalism, 1804. It doesn't discuss the reality of 1804 either. They were deeply divided. Some of them hated each other. They killed each other. There were racial divisions. There were divisions within the slaves, within the Mossad. the whole thing was really very paradoxical. There was one moment where you fight because you hate the slave owners, which is normal, but after that, what the hell do you do? You reproduce a lot of things that were completely disgusting. I mean, the Messianic, Dessalines, Toussaint, Pétion, all of them are Messianic. All of them are despots. They treat the freed people like they were, to put it like BS. They wanted the code rural, they wanted this. I mean, we should not idealize that either. It's the most, I agree, it's the most radical moment. But what it creates is very problematic.
Right. I mean, we should idealize it, but we should have a film that can explore these complexities as well.
Oh, that's
Well, much
fine.
like Laurent said, there's room for more than one book, there's also room for more than one movie.
Every genre. But I do think that, sorry. No, I mean, I think the question of the timing is really interesting, because I would be very interested in a movie that takes a trajectory across the Haitian Revolution, before and after, right? Precisely to get at this.
Yeah.
But not about the top levels, but,
Oh, that would be fine.
I think that would be, and then you could kind of see, which, I mean, if you think about it, it's interesting, because Alejo Carpentier's book also kind of, in the Keynesian world, kind of skips the whole Haitian Revolution, interestingly. Like, it kind of, it's right there at the beginning, and then it comes at the end. So it's interesting. I mean, Rosa La Femme, which is the book by Adeline Fouillot, which is leading up to the Haitian Revolution, is about women in that context. It's just interesting how, I think the fiction writers have begun to suggest ways of angling into it. That are very, very interesting. But anyway.
I'm wondering how much of it is just a larger problem with revolutionary violence, period.
Yeah.
There's no good Hollywood movie about the French Revolution, right? I mean, Marie Antoinette,
The Polish film don't,
It's a Polish film,
Yeah, it's a
how
weird
long ago
Polish
was it made?
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
black and
No,
white,
you're
and
right.
they
It's
show it
just
in the
an
plazas,
exception.
like there's no sort of Hollywood version. So there's a guy been trying to get a Napoleon biopic made for like 20 years, right? And,
Even in France, they haven't made that.
Yeah, so I think that there's like a question about how much of this is about sort of the specificities in Haiti, and how much of it, especially in the Hollywood kind of big budget context, is a sort of deep discomfort with the idea of political violence, and particularly sort of foundational revolutionary violence.
There aren't even a lot of good movies about the American.
The Patriot.
What? You mean the movie where Mel Gibson doesn't have slaves, he just has people who work the land? That's a line in there, right? Like, whoa, these people? Yeah.
But it's always retaliatory, right? The violence always
Yeah.
starts with the oppressors, and then so the idea like you're not gonna put the Jacobins at the center of any color at the center of your
That's an
Hollywood
obvious
version.
Anne Brown was saying earlier too.
It's Battle of Algiers.
Mel Gibson's History of the World Part 1.
If I can bring this back to Avengers, I think one of the amazing things about Avengers is that you tell the history of the Haitian Revolution in one book, which is still something that is extremely difficult to do. So we were talking earlier about how I'm trying to do it in a chapter, and it's like impossible, thanks to my third year review committee. And just this question of how do you tell the Haitian Revolution, whether in film or in history, is quite difficult, right? Because as Julia pointed out, this is not one unified political movement. And I think part of the genius of Avengers is being able to tell the history of the Haitian Revolution in all of its epic, wonderful, absolute importance to world history without sacrificing the complexity of the Congo, of the despotic nature of Toussaint Louverture, who I think is either despot or tyrant, I can't remember, but there are no heroes, there are some villains, but overall the book is incredibly elegant and important for its sophistication in handling all of these issues. And I'm going to tease you because I invited Laurent to UNC my first year of grad school, and my first question was, why did you end the book in 1804? And he said, because I didn't want to have to explain anything that happened afterwards, which has now become my cross to bear in finishing my book, unfortunately.
When I asked him the same question, he was like, you gotta end somewhere.
Better answer.
So what do you want, like a 9,000 page book?
But I think that the point I'm trying to make is I think that you put enough complexity in Avengers that it opened a space for people to talk about what happens afterwards.
Right.
So by telling the story in a way that is so complex, I think that's why, as we're all here today. That's why the book is so important. And it's also why it's so difficult, whether in film or television or any other genre, to tell this story, because you really can't tell it without including all of that complexity. Or you do a fundamental
and you say, I don't know what, another producer does the rest.
And then like, you know, good luck, Haiti. Yeah. But it's true. I'll just quickly say that when I wrote Aftershocks, which then I didn't stick to my thing, and I was like, but it was interesting because I thought, for instance, the question of how to write the beginning of that book is the Haitian Revolution, and I realized that I ended up with a totally different Haitian Revolution when I was looking forward. You know what I mean? Like, there was, once I was saying, okay, we have to start the story of modern Haiti, it was actually a totally different narrative. I mean, it was a narrative that emphasized different things. You know, and because precisely it can't be the same story. This is a romance in a certain way, and you know, no, but it is. I mean,
it's a great book. And you know that.
But I mean, like, you know, by stopping 1804, you're allowed an arc.
Yeah, but it's a great book.
You couldn't like
whether you like it or not. Yeah, great book.
But also, yeah, but I like. Somebody else brought up Game of Thrones. I mean, I think all the best writing now is in these extended television series, not movies. And by doing an extended show, even across a couple of years, you could do, and it could be to go to the, like George R.R. Martin, it could, different points of view, different people's stories. So it could start with, you know, women who people would have never heard of, or, you know, it could start with the people that C.L.R. James is trying to center, and then it could move to some of the other leaders, you know, but it could cut back and forth, and then get in, you know, those very, very different perspectives, and following some of the fiction writers that have taken these epic sweeps. I think of Peter Abrams' book View from Hoyoba, so he's South African, and it's set in Jamaica, and he's imagining it. He cuts across these he imagines generations of families, but it starts with the just sort of the devastation of the Caribbean people, and then cuts to maroon communities, and then cuts into 20th century anti-colonial movements, and sort of then another generation of children who are meeting W.E.B. Du Bois and going to Africa. So he gets this very imaginative sweep, and you could, you know, take the implications of the Haitian Revolution through, you know, through the to the U.S. invasion, through the dictators, through the moments when you get productions like C.L.R. James' play and Paul Robeson's play, and in The Emperor Jones, and then why do those things come into focus in that moment in the 30s? Why do they leave? Anyway, so I think this would be. I think, you know, you should all. I mean, I don't work at Haiti, but I think
create a collective.
I think you should pitch this, but I think that's no, totally.
Amazon, we're calling it Amazon, right?
Yeah, but then you get the legacies and why it's come in and out of view.
I need help. Perhaps you guys can help me with La Tragédie du Roi Christophe. Why has it not been evoked? What is most problematic from the perspective that you guys are looking at in terms of telling the story of the Haitian Revolution or parts of it? Why is La Tragédie du Roi Christophe not central to our conversation?
I mean, I feel like we should direct this to Marlene. Because Marlene, I don't know how much of your project you want to talk about, but I do think that the whole question of Christophe is a totally fascinating one.
They were too afraid to bring up, they thought Christophe, because they thought they were stepping on my toes. No.
But I mean, the idea of the story of that kingdom, and I mean, what both C.L.R, but there's so much that could be done, and in the website, the Gazette website that Marlena has, there's so much description actually now, thanks to we have this incredible picture of that world. And that's really interesting, you know. I mean, in that you can kind of imagine that as another, you know, in the Black Kingdom. Right?
But Gregory has worked on Neri and Charlotte plays that precede the La Tragédie du Roi Christophe, so I'm sure you have things to say about them. Sorry, I put you on the spot, but yeah.
Just wondering. Well, I think historically it's also would be one of those things where like you find out there was all this documentation. Everybody was writing about the kingdom while it was. You know, in the 1810s and to 1820, it's all over European American news all the time. And I think the minute it collapses, then, you know, what reputation it had around the world collapses with it, like in ways that
again, like dig a hole where there was a mountain, right? Again, so everybody, it was known, it was very well known, and again discussed, and people were reading, writers from the kingdom. They were reading news from the kingdom. They were reading everything the kingdom was producing, and all of a sudden there's nothing. And I think, I feel like that's the next horizon in like Haitian studies outside of Haiti, because of course, people write about stuff in Haiti, but is that this sort of like constant rediscovery of things that were always already there. So I think that's what happens next. But I think you're right. But in some ways, he has been written about also, right? I mean, you will find, again, there were plays about him in Great Britain. They just haven't procured, right?
I think that the question of the tragic, though, this is what we keep coming back. In other words, in the tragic register, I think these things can be told, right? But part of what we're talking about is like, what could there be told in some other register? I mean, one that wouldn't deny the tragic or violent aspects, but wouldn't necessarily be in the form of a tragedy, and I don't think that's what C.L.R. really meant only, but even with Glissant's writings on Toussaint, there is this kind of sense, in other words, if it is that story of a lost possibility, that I think has a space, but it sounds like we're thinking about what other energies could you infuse the story with. And I do think, and the relationship between C.L.R.'s book on the Haitian Revolution and those, it's very, very interesting. C.L.R. I think was deeply shaped by Haiti. And it's Alex Gilles, has worked on there are also these plays that he didn't quite, something that he wrote while he was in Haiti that he never quite finished. And there's a lot there. I think the place of Haiti in C.L.R.'s thought is really interesting, I think, and I kind of unresolved and a sort of unresolved relationship too.
He was also that group, right? The
Sorry.
He was, with Zach and Arturo, this group with Christophe's appreciation society.
Oh, yeah, they did. There was a Christophe. Since you guys have poked the bear, though, I'm sorry. I just have to Is Christophe is he an Avenger?
Which Avenger is he? Of course he's an Avenger, but which one?
Yeah, which one?
Is he Black Panther? No, he's not Black Panther. Is he
So it's interesting country question because that's a figure who hasn't actually even come up in passing at all. You always come up who actually wasn't mentioned, so it is interesting.
I want to have the Boyer biopic next.
I think one of the problems posed by the Christophe story is like what we've been talking about, sort of what sizzles about the Haitian Revolution is this sort of like potential to tell a story of collective social change. And your line that from the book that Julia quoted about like if democracy is meant to include everyone, it's because of the work of these men and women. But the Christophe story ends with a monarchy. Like the democracy question falls away entirely and it becomes a government that reinscribes certain sort of European-based power, or not democracy has its own roots there too, but like reinscribes this concept of authoritarian rule in a much more obvious way that doesn't leave as much narrative potential for all these stories about like the small people who helped us. And so I think that's one of the reasons that when we're talking about like how to represent this in a way that would speak to this moment that we're in now, it hasn't come up. It doesn't do the same political work that I think we are kind of hoping a narrative of this story could do, maybe. Or not, if you're Robert.
Equally governor for life, authoritarian. Dessalines is an emperor, very nasty. Picture the same. We don't have really.
No, but there have been movies. We've had movies about Napoleon, right? I guess part of the question is what kind of. Is it going to be a romance of the nation state, right? Because that's the thing. That's the only way you make those movies, and they exist, and you can be fine with that. But that's the way you make them, right? If you tell the real story, it's not just really good. Yeah. And then but you want to tell a romance of the nation state.
I think part of
that's what all those movies we talk about are, right?
Yeah. I think part of it, what's interesting is that even probably the step to take, right, would be if one could figure out a way to just make a film that happened during the Haitian Revolution. It wasn't actually about the Haitian Revolution. You know what I mean? No, but I'm serious. In other words, if the context of the Haitian Revolution just became like a normal place in which you could then have a story about love, or you could, whatever you might, there's plenty of drama to go around, right? Migration, movement, anything, right? And that would be interesting. Like, in other words, that's sort of, maybe that would be the first step, right? Because partly the burden of sort of trying to say, like, I'm going to tell the story of this thing, right? But it's interesting that even that is difficult, right? To sort of, that this might be just a normal, and it is, I mean, you think about Jordan Peele or other, I mean, the kind of idea of just sort of normalizing sort of things that are in situations that, that people normally don't set things in could be interesting.
So is it Dr. Dubois?
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned an increase, excuse me.
Oh, no, that's okay, especially if it's gonna be about Avengers, because I'm gonna ask a different question.
Oh, me too.
Oh.
So you mentioned there being an increase in the intellectual and scholarly production on Haiti for the past 15 years or so. Could you elaborate on that? What are some of the factors that have played a role in that increase?
I mean, that's a good question, and others could question.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think, you know, there was a moment, 2004 was a moment in which there was a number of academic conferences around the Haitian 200-year anniversary of the Haitian Revolution, more connections, you know, the development of connections between Haitian and US scholars, I mean, things like that kind of, I mean, I think these things have been growing for some time. Obviously, just in a sense, it's just a kind of larger part of the growth of Black studies and Afro-diasporic studies and so forth, right, that this becomes, when you're working in that area, Haiti has a presence, right? And obviously has a presence in African-American thought. So that kind of sense that there's this story, I think the desire to teach about race, colonialism, slavery in the United States in ways that decenter some narratives, right, that kind of add, it is true that when you teach about the Haitian Revolution, you kind of get at things and you kind of, I guess, destabilize to some extent students, I think, in the United States and force them to think in different ways. So I think all those are factors, right? And then I also just think it's just, I mean, it's incredibly interesting. There's a huge amount that can be done. There are vast archives that are really interesting that have not been, you know, utilized as much as they could. So there's also just a terrain that I think is interesting. And I think in general, the field of Haitian studies is like a very loving field. I don't know if that's like a good way to describe it, but you know what I mean? It's a quite supportive field, that there's a sort of sense of collective mission. Obviously the Haiti earthquake in 2010 played a role there too, but some kind of collective mission and sort of a shared agenda that whatever the different approaches people are taking, it's important to do this work, right? And so I think all those have helped to kind of generate something. And I think, you know, in very different disciplines too, obviously in literature and performance studies and in anthropology and so forth. So I guess that's, yeah. I mean, obviously there's other factors.
Let's talk about that now.
That's right.
Well, Deborah has a question too, I think.
Yeah, my question was to Julia about the title, Meet Haiti's Founding Father, whose Black Revolution was too radical for Thomas Jefferson.
Not your title.
It's not my title.
Well, no, that the editor made you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about that and what place Jefferson has in the essay.
It's, yeah, it was something I fought against in that, and I repeatedly proposed other titles that did not have Thomas Jefferson in them. And the context for the editor reinserting Thomas Jefferson was, I believe that Dessalines wrote a letter to him to which he never responded.
Oh.
So that was in the article, and therefore had to go with the title because Thomas Jefferson's name appeared.
So what was the letter?
It was in 1803, amongst other letters that Dessalines wrote to other regional leaders, in which he advised them that he was preparing for the independence of the country, and that he was inviting merchants from other nations to come trade. He was kind of setting the stage for his Declaration of Independence and assuring that he would have kind of allies going forward.
And Jefferson didn't answer.
No, he did not.
And Deborah has a wonderful project with James Perla, who's in the back there. Thank you, videotaping all of this. Called Notes on the State about Jefferson, and they have an episode upcoming about Haiti. So
Okay.
you all should definitely talk.
Well, maybe you all could. What should be central to a podcast on Jefferson and Haiti?
I mean, I think the silence should be central in some ways, right? The fact that there was
Silence?
that Jefferson didn't respond.
Oh, that's not.
The non-response, yes.
Yeah, oh, okay, good.
I think it's worth mentioning, and for the implications in terms of his politics and what it says that he was not even willing to accept a letter or respond to a letter, and kind of contextually, the governor of Jamaica responded, right? So there's like a context in which some people do respond and some people don't respond, and we think of, you know, Jefferson as the founder of all equality or whatever. And yet, it's the governor of Jamaica who decides to respond and negotiate with Dessalines. So sitting with the silence, I think, would be worthwhile, and what that means and what it says about other people he's willing to respond to, or other aspects of his policy that get undermined by this non-gesture.
You can call it silencing the president.
It's also, especially the contrast, because Adams dealt with Toussaint very closely, directly, you know, so there was a whole precedent for the United States having no problem essentially trading and participating, you know, so it's interesting that Jefferson actually alters the policy and creates this kind of, and then does put in place the
And then follows it up with a kind of encouragement to Congress to prohibit trade with Haiti, which ends up happening in 1806, although he puts it on the table first in 1805. So, yes, that silence is then paired with policies designed to limit the success, I guess.
It was simultaneously like be on the good side of France to get Louisiana, or at least capitalize on that debt. That weird, strange sort of.
I mean, the other thing is that Toussaint is that Dessalines, you know, as obviously Dessalines is like one of the most important figures in Toussaint Louverture. I'm sorry, in Jefferson's life. Like Jefferson owes the whole Louisiana purchase to him. So there should be statues to Dessalines, maybe not in Haiti, but in New Orleans.
What about next to Jefferson?
When you have all the monument debates, and people are like, but what should we have monuments to? And you can make a beautiful equestrian statue of Toussaint Louverture. Place it, you know.
Take down Jefferson.
You're all being given, by the way.
You can even keep the horse.
Keep the horse.
Cheap renovation.
Well, I think we should let our visitors rest, but thank you all very much for coming.